welcome back to our Mitts Sew Along. I'm Melissa with Burnley and Trowbridge. If you haven't already watched part one of our sew along for our mitts, you probably want to go back and watch that so you can get caught up and continue on building yourself a really nice pair of mitts. In this part of our sew along, we will be finishing our mitts by putting them together and doing our open work or faggoting stitches. If you are not familiar with doing a faggoting stitch, please check out our YouTube quick stitch tutorial on the faggoting stitch. So let's get started with today's lessons. Now that you have your thumb ready to go, it's a good time to try it on. Make sure it fits the way you want it to. Should also make sure that you can bend your thumb easily and make any alterations that you decide need to be done. The next step in our mitt construction is to attach our thumb to the body of the mitt. The thumb seam should match the dot that is above the point at the top of your thumb hole. So this here. You can pin or baste this together to start. I then like to move to the opposite point, which is the base of the thumb, and pin that down. Just to make sure that it's sitting nicely. And then I'll pin the quarter points. The way I'm doing the lining with these mitts, I'm going to want to make sure that when I stitch the thumb to the mitt, I am just stitching to the outside fabric and not to the lining. So what I'm going to do is go back through and shift my pins so that they are not going through the lining. They are just going through the fashion fabric and the thumb. You can also do this just as you are pinning. That way you don't have to go back and redo it. There's our thumb all pinned into our mitt. As you can see, I did not catch the lining. And if you think that this hole seems a little small right now, it's okay. It will get bigger, and I will show you that at a later step. You can baste your thumb in if you want. And to set your thumb, you just want to use a whip stitch and just start stitching around the thumb. I personally find it easiest to keep my finger inside the thumb between the lining and the outer fabric. That way I don't have to worry that I am catching the lining while I'm stitching the thumb to the mitt. You want to use a small, fairly closely spaced whip stitch while you're stitching your thumb to your mitt. The thumb will get a fair amount of stress, so you want to make sure that it is well secured to the mitt. Once you have your thumb sewn to the outside layer of fabric, go ahead and turn it wrong side out. So you can see there's a very healthy seam allowance around the thumb between the layers of fashion fabric and lining. So what we're going to do is trim that down a little bit. You can kind of pull that whole thumb bit through your lining hole and trim it down some. Don't get too close to your stitching line. You do want to take some of the bulk and the tightness out of that thumb hole area so that it sits where it needs to on your hand. Doesn't have to be pretty. Nobody's going to see this part. Now I'm also going to make some snips into that seam allowance. Again, not getting too close to my stitching line because I don't want to alter the structural integrity of my stitching. I am going to want to turn this seam allowance away from the thumb so that it will lay nice and flat against your hand. I'm going to push the thumb back through the lining, and I'm going to trim the lining down a little bit as well. And you can feel where that seam line is so that you can pay attention and not get too carried away with trimming out your lining. If you're worried about it, just trim a little bit at a time. It's a lot easier to take more out than it is to put something back. All right, and then I'm going to do the same with some little snips into the lining that I did with the fashion fabric. Once I think that my seam allowances are where I need them, I can go through, and I'm using my thumb inside to push the seam allowance of the outer fabric away from the thumb, and then I'll just roll the lining in. It doesn't have to actually meet right up against the seam where you stitch the thumb in, but you want it to give you ample room to move and to get the thumb against your hand where it needs to be. If you're not getting as much of a fold of the seam allowance, go ahead and go back and trim more out. The base of the thumb is where you're going to have the most seam allowance, and so that will probably take the most fiddling with and trimming out. Now that we have the lining all pinned in, we can go ahead and stitch that down. So now you can whip your lining down, being careful not to catch the outer fabric while you're doing it. These stitches also do not have to be as small as the ones were on the outside. And now your thumb is all tidied up on the inside as well. Now that we have our thumb set on our mitt, we are going to add the openwork serpentine opening, or the little slash that goes at the wrist. If you look at original 18th century mitts, the slash usually starts just below the hem at the palm to about a third of the way down the palm. And it runs anywhere between halfway to 2/3 of the way up your forearm. This will be a personal choice as well as a design element as to how you want to do your wrist slash. Most of the time, they do curve around the thumb, and then they will sometimes curve back out. Sometimes they do a little squiggle. Sometimes they're relatively straight. So look at original garments and see what is most pleasing to you or easiest for you to draw, whichever the case may be. After looking at several extants as well as images of 18th century mitts, the slit that I chose to do starts about half an inch below the hem at the palm and runs about 2/3 of the way up the forearm. As you can see, I just drew a single line. This is going to be our cutting line, and then we will put a narrow hem in on either side of the cutting line to give us our finished edges that we are going to then faggot. So after I drew the line on my pattern, I then took a heavy pin and made holes about every 3/4 of an inch or so is probably where they ended up, so that I can easily transfer this line to my mitts, which is what we're going to do now. Using where the thumb is sewn in to the mitt as a guide, which I can feel under the pattern, I'm placing the pattern on top of the mitt, and I'm going to pin it down to secure it just so it doesn't wiggle around while I am transferring my marks. If you want to, you can draw this line on your mitts before you get them all cut out and put together. Then I'm going to take my chalk pencil and just make a little mark through each of my punched holes. And then I can use this same pattern piece and just flip it over to the other side to do the other mitt and do it from the back side of the pattern. And then I usually like to just kind of roll the pattern back a little bit and make sure that my marks transferred, which they did. So then I can remove my pattern and use my chalk or pencil to connect the dots. So now I have the cut line drawn onto this mitt. What I'm going to do next, even though you may have noticed I don't always baste, this time I am going to baste the fabric to the lining about a ½ inch or so away from the line on both sides. That way it makes it a little easier to make sure that you're cutting both layers stacked on top of each other so that one doesn't get off kilter a little bit, because that will cause wrinkles in your mitt. And it also makes it a little bit easier when you go to fold the edges of this slit under and hem them. Once you've basted around the slit, comes the scary part. We're going to actually cut this. The way I usually do this is to use a very sharp pair of embroidery scissors, or you could use a sharp razor blade or X-Acto knife to get this started. Make sure that you're staying directly on the line and cut up towards one end, and then I will start back in the middle and cut up towards the other end. I'm not going to cut all the way to the very end of my line, because the end of the line is where I want the hem to actually be. I'm going to stop 1/4 inch-ish away from that end. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut the other direction. You do want to cut this line as smoothly as you can, not make it a choppy line, just because it will be easier then for you to turn under your hem allowances. Now that we have our slit cut open, we need to hem it. I turn under about 1/8 of an inch on either side. You do not want a terribly large hem, because then that will give you a very large opening. So you just want to go along and turn that under. Finger pressing is always a good idea as you're working, to give you a little better edge with which to work. I personally like to work from the center of my slit towards the ends. You can do it however is comfortable for you. On some mitts, you will see that the area from about the center of the thumb to 1 inch-ish below the thumb is a little bit wider than the rest of the slit, and sometimes the bottom edge will even be a little bit narrower. It's entirely up to you if you want to make those types of adjustments to the width of your slit. When you get to the ends, those are really fiddly. What you usually see on extant garments is at the ends of the slit, they are not a sharp point, but a very rounded end. So one of the ways to make that a little bit easier is to cut a couple of little slits right at the ends, and that way you can manipulate the fabric a little easier. It's just going to be a very fiddly thing, and you're going to have to be careful as you're hemming it. You will probably need to take stitches that are closer together than what you do on the rest of your slit. Once you have your wrist slash all pinned up or basted and ready to go, we're going to hem the lining to the fashion fabric just like we did on the entire outer edge of our mitt. As you're working, you may need to keep fiddling with and adjusting your hem allowances just to make sure that you are catching the fabric properly. The hardest part of this particular section of our mitts is doing the ends. They get very fiddly. Just take your time, take smaller stitches. If you need to whip them together rather than hemming them, that's fine. You see that some on extant garments. Whatever you can do to make it work. Now that our serpentine slit is all hemmed up, we can go ahead and take out our basting threads and get ready to do our faggoting stitch on this particular section. If you don't know how to do your faggoting stitch, you can find a tutorial, which is also on our YouTube channel under our quick stitch tutorials. So we're going to take out our basting. Looking at extant garments, it seems that the faggoting stitch is usually done with a thread that is double whatever was used for the embroidery on the mitts. So I am using a double thread of our silk quilter's twist. Like it says in the tutorial, you can baste a piece of fabric or paper underneath the slit to keep it from being pulled out of shape while you were stitching. You do not want to pull these stitches too tight because that will then defeat the purpose of them to give you ease of movement to get into your mitts. You also want to make sure that you're catching both the outer fabric and the lining as you're doing this stitch. You do want to keep your stitches fairly close together when you're doing your faggoting, as it helps to maintain the shape of your slit. If you've chosen not to baste a piece of fabric or paper behind your slit, you may want to lay it down every so often just to make sure that you're not pulling your stitches too tightly and that they are still giving you the spacing of that slit that you actually want to see. The next step in this video is something that can actually be done prior to assembling your mitts. if you choose to do it that way. I like to do it at this stage of construction just because it makes it a little easier to get it just where I want it. And so I am going to do some decorative stitching. On originals, you will frequently see the herringbone stitch, which is what we did for our lines here, around the base of the thumb. Sometimes you will see it on the body of the mitt, outside of the thumb seam, as well as inside the thumb seam on the thumb itself. Sometimes you will see it straddling this thumb seam, and we'll even see it as the way to attach the thumb to the body of the mitt. You will also frequently see it around the top edge of the thumb, all the way around the outer edge of the mitt body itself, as well as around your open worked serpentine slit. For help doing the herringbone stitch, you can check out our quick stitch tutorial on the herringbone stitch on our YouTube channel. For my mitt, I'm going to do the herringbone stitch so that it straddles the thumb seam. And I'll show you how that's going to work right now. When you're doing your herringbone stitch on your lined mitts, it can go through the lining and the outer fabric, or you can do it just through the outer fabric. Both techniques are seen on extant garments. I'm going to attempt to do my stitching just through the outer fabric and not through the lining. So it's going to take me a little bit longer to do it, but that's just how I roll. Now that you've finished the faggoting on the serpentine slit of your mitts, you can see what I was talking about, how it gives, so it will give you room when you are putting your mitts on, and then keep them nice and snug and hopefully wrinkle free while you're wearing them. The last thing we will need to do is we're going to use the same faggoting technique to do our side seams. For this particular area, I do prefer to actually baste my mitts to a piece of fabric where I have marked a 1/4 inch spacing. So I'm just going to take a ruler and a pencil on a piece of scrap fabric, mark a line, mark my 1/4 inch. If you have a clear quilting ruler, this is so much easier. And then we mark our second line a 1/4 inch away. If you want to pin before you baste, you can certainly do that. We're going to see how good I am and try to do it without pinning. You want to give yourself room to still be able to stitch, so you don't want to baste too close to that edge. I'm going to give myself about a 1/4 inch of ease to be able to get my needle in the fabric without catching the scrap fabric that is behind the mitts. Basting the second side of the side seam is a little more challenging. So I'm going to go ahead and pin my mitts to my waist fabric in a couple of spots just to keep things lined up. I find that it's easier to keep things lined up if I can baste flat on the table, but because this is a tube now, I don't want to run the risk of stitching it to the other side of the mitt. So I'm going to run my ruler inside the mitt so that I can stitch onto that instead of accidentally catching the other side of the fabrics. You can also do that with a sleeve board if your mitts are big enough to fit on a sleeve board, or if you have a sleeve board small enough. And we'll just baste this on here real quick. So you can see that even though our side seams of our mitts are not straight, once you have basted it to this line, it keeps them fairly straight so that you can get a nice even spacing for your faggoting stitch. And you want to do this faggoting stitch just the same way you did it on the serpentine piece at the wrist. When you're doing your faggoting stitch along here, you do want to be careful that you don't accidentally stitch through your waist fabric that is on the inside of your mitt. So just be aware of that as you're stitching. And now you have a finished pair of mitts, which you can go out and show off to all your friends and finish off your 18th century outfit. They're also great for modern wear if you need some sun protection or a little warmth. Thank you for joining us for our Mitts Sew Along. Make sure to like this video, subscribe, and follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Tag us with hashtag #ShowYourMitts on Instagram and Facebook. And until next time, just keep stitching.